Welcome to the Waiting List podcast. Tell us a story.
It's like many things you start building from scratch.
And then I'm like, wait, I really do like watches because
You've seen so many watches that makes you excited.
I think I really do like watches.
Yeah. I think it's a great way to see if you are a watch enthusiast.
Welcome to another episode of the Waiting List podcast, where I, Long, am joined with my co-hosts Jack and Dan today. Today, our special guest is Tim Mosso from Watchbox. If his name does not ring a bell, his voice probably will. As the media director and watch specialist at Watchbox, Tim has amassed over 250,000 subscribers on his two YouTube channels and produced more than 6,000 videos. So without further ado, let's jump right in. All right, Tim. So with all the watch review videos you have produced, what is the process like? How long do you spend with a watch before you start producing the content?
I would say if the video is 6 minutes long, the process is 8 minutes long. So I get the watch and everyone knows the diameter because it's published. But what I do is I measure everything, the space between the lug horns, the lug to lug dimension, the thickness. And so once I've got those basic measurements, I'll think, okay, what are three things I need to say about the watch? How does it look? How does it fit? And how does it work? And then I just shoot the video, and it's a one-take process.
Which, by the way,
Okay.
I must say, I really appreciate you mentioning the dimensions, especially the lug width, because sometimes I'll be looking for a watch and it has no mention of the lug width. And if I'm interested, I usually would want to make a strap beforehand, and I go to your videos if you've made a video on it, and that's like the primary source I go to. So I've watched so many of your reviews, like even before I knew about watches, I would say. I'll just go on record there. So thank you so much for doing what you do. I know it's your job, but I really appreciate, all the really simple details that you would just put in onto a watch review. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. It is my job, but if it were just a job, I would have stopped, I don't know, 5 years ago. It's something I enjoy doing because I'm building a database, and whether you buy from Watchbox or not, I like to think that we are the standard of reference and the place people go to research watches. And while it's nice to have really high value videos where you're putting out like one, maybe two a week, if you want to have that searchable database, you can't be spending 30 hours a week putting together a video with all the cuts and splices and music. So I do it one take, and I just give you something that is like, it's like Google for watches or an encyclopedia for watches, and you're always going to find at least something similar to what you're looking for.
Totally.
But how about all the research? Because you say certain facts. It's very factual for a start, your video. It's like, I would say, less about the watch story and more actual the factual stuff. Maybe stuff that you would really consider close to your purchase decision. But you really know your facts. You're like just a factual guy. Surely that takes a lot of time to research.
It doesn't really, because most of the watches we sell at Watchbox are modern watches. So just about everything we sell has been released since 2000. Vintage is not a big part of our business. So all these watches have come out in the era of the internet. And when you launch a watch in the internet era, there's always a press release. So if I've got to check something that I can't definitely verify from the watch itself, I'll look for the original press release. And for me, that's legitimate. I don't like it when I see a video where someone's talking about stuff that was gleaned from someone else's research. So that's not the kind of material. Like, I'm not going to tell you how many Rolex, 6200s were made, or how many 5510, big crowns were made, because that's not something I can verify personally or through a press release. I would have to rely on a Osvaldo Patrizzi or John Goldberg or someone like that. And then I think you go from being an explainer to, almost like plagiarism. So I stay away from that sort of thing.
But just talking about movements, I recently watched one of your videos. Actually, it was a while ago, but it really stuck in my mind. I don't know why this particular video stuck in my mind. I think we were talking about, somebody was asking you about the 5270. It was with somebody, 5270 Patek and the 5970 Patek. And they were talking about the movement. And you very quickly said, oh, for me, it's the Lemania all the way down. It's the superior movement. Maybe I don't know my movements as well, because obviously, for those that don't know, that are listening, we're talking about perpetual chronos from Patek, first of all. And the 5970 uses a Lemania based movement, and the 15270 uses their first in-house perpetual chrono movement. So I just wanted to hear your take, because I couldn't ask you on the video because I wasn't there.
Why
you came up with that decision, because I think it's something that I discuss with my friends, and it's quite important in that purchase decision, like in-house, non-in-house.
Yeah. In-house means nothing there. If you look at what that Lamagna movement looks like before Patek finishes it, it looks like something you'd find in an Omega Speedmaster Professional in 1965. It's the same Lamagna 2310 Bausch, and Patek makes a ton of changes to it. I wouldn't say it's technically the superior movement, because in terms of technology and features, it isn't. What it is scarce, because the need to get the Bausch, finish the Bausch, make the mechanical improvements, with so much of the process out of Patek's hands, they could build fewer of those watches. So even with something like the 5070, which was a simple chronograph that used that movement, they were only able to build about 250 per metal per year. So, there were 4 years the yellow gold, 4 years the rose gold, 4 years the white gold. Add a perpetual calendar complication to the equation, and then you're looking at a really scarce timepiece. Whereas with the 5270, that movement was designed from the beginning to be amenable to mass production, so there will be more of them. And with the supply chains essentially limited to things like springs and stones, they can produce much more of it under their own roof in much higher volumes. So the Lamagna for scarcity, not technologically superior, and probably a lot smaller relative to the case than the 29535. But for me, the Lamagna is the tradition, the scarcity, the collector hook that kind of grabs your heart and hangs on to it.
And would you say the same about the 5204 as compared to the predecessor?
I would, but I like the size of the 5004 a lot more. I would say it's a better match between, I guess, expectations and the in-house value that goes into the watch. But the original 5004, for me, it's a much better sized and much more attractive watch. And that's what I go by. That's why, for example, I like the 5070 better than the 5170. The movement's nice, but you can't wear them upside down. I would say everything that's true about the 5204 and the 5004 is true of the the 5970 and the 5270. But for me, the 36 millimeter case makes it far more special, the 5004. The scarcity of that watch makes it more special. And I can tell you from the number of 5204s that I see that there are far more of them in the world, and more all the time. So nice watch, but just too heavy, too thick, too broad. And I don't think the technical improvements of the movement are really worthwhile. The hook with the 5070 is the way it looks. The hook with the 5004 is the way it fits.
Very well said.
Like that, yeah.
All right. So going back to you taking about 8 minutes to make a video, very minimal editing. What is a day at work like then? What do you do at work?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I'm doing today. So today, after I'm done with this, I'm teaching some folks for about an hour. We have salesmen, and globally, I'm one of the lead trainers. I'll be training them about the brands Maitre du Temps and also MB&F. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes on each one. I've prepared supplemental materials that they can take home, download, and use for reference. So that's where my day starts on this particular Friday. I'm also going to shoot somewhere between 5 and 10 1-minute videos for Instagram. It's the same process, one take. And I'm going to shoot a 40-minute inventory show with about 15 watches that I will use over the weekend to advertise those watches and vector people back to our site, where it's literally the stuff that we don't have on our website for the most part. So this is one way to reach customers. When you have a watch that requires an extended discussion to sell, it's not just like a point and click checkout cart type thing. And in the instance, of a tourbillon from H. Moser and C, or perhaps a Grubel 4C, but Balancier S sports watch, you really want to talk to the customer before selling it. So that video that I make, which airs on Saturday, is designed to start the conversation with the customer. I'll also spend about an hour on my Facebook, which is a new thing I have. It's Talking Time with Tim Mosso. It's a Facebook group. We got about 4,200 members. And then, of course, I'll post a few of those videos to Instagram and just do a round the block check of my social media to make sure nothing's on fire.
When I listen to the way you describe just the amount of content that you put out in a day, and I know this is your job, but still, I can't help but wonder whether you were this confident in terms of just being like, I'm just going to put it out. It doesn't have to be perfect. Were you always like this, or this was something that developed over time?
No, it's something I had from the beginning. It was a skill that I carried with me from, I mean, I was a debate champion in high school, so it goes way back. But
Mm-hmm.
also, when I was in the Navy, I was a press officer. So I had a lot of experience dealing with people and also being precise and
Mm-hmm.
focused. And I worked in naval aviation. I wasn't a pilot, I was a press officer.
Yeah.
But I would take something that was highly technical and abstruse and engineering driven, and then I would make it more emotional and immediate and accessible for like the local population around the airbase. So it's not altogether different from what I do with watches, because these things are, after all, engineered products, but the consumer side is almost entirely built on emotional appeal. So building that bridge is part of what I do. I'll also say I've got a crazy week because I do different things every day. Some days I'll shoot, 8 to 12 individual watch videos. I write an article a week. I create a
Mhm.
podcast each week. I've also got timmosso.com. And then there's my Monday show. If you've seen Watches Tonight, you know that it's almost like an evening show format. And so that's got to be prepared as well. So that's sort of my week. Plus I meet with clients.
This
Mm.
I'm blown away. Like,
Yeah.
your time management must be on point, because it was actually one of my questions, because I read, I read and found out that you used to be in the Navy, right? And I always wondered whether the skills that you have picked up there transferred into what you're doing now, even being punctual on the dot and being able to just keep going through the day, right?
Without a doubt. I mean, ultimately, what I did in the Navy was I provided a sort of liaison between the public and the base's mission. And so I dealt with people in media. I dealt with very high ranking officials where you have to get it right the first time, politicians, naval commanders, and then just people who showed up because they wanted to use the base golf course, basically running the gamut. You'd be amazed. Retirees.
I have a question. I wanted to ask, you were in the game very early, like watch media game. I remember when I was first starting getting into watches, I already knew about you, amongst the big bloggers the more influential bloggers to me, I would say Ariel Adams and Ben Clymer when he was first starting Hodinkee. But you quickly went into not necessarily full-time blogging, like writing articles, but straight into video very early. What made you do that? And like everybody seemed to be writing articles at that time, and yet you went and did something different. What was the reasoning behind that decision?
Well, it was to set us apart. Initially, I was hired to be a ghostwriter for the owner of Watch You Want, and the idea was that he would speak to text, and I would take that mess of mangled speak to text, and I would write articles based on whatever topics he had in mind. But then also the company wanted me to write endless blogs about watches they had in stock. And I thought, nothing gets less respect or attention than a vendor blog on a sales site. So look, you're never going to outdo all the companies that have been paying to be on the front page of Google, or all of the websites like a Blog to Watch or Hodinkee that have been indexing for over a decade and get priority in search. So let me move into video and just, in the time it takes me to write an article, shoot 8 watches, get them all up on YouTube, and use the world's second largest search engine, which is YouTube, in order to get you some views on these things. And so that was sort of the idea. Just take an area that hadn't been saturated by an established power, move away from the blogs and the journal type sites, and establish ourselves in video before those other guys do. So,
Okay.
if you look at Hodinkee and the volume they get on their website, I can't compete with that on timmosso.com or a blog section of the Watchbox. But if you look at the number of views Hodinkee's YouTube channel has in its entire history, it's less than I've gotten on my review channel since 2017. So that was sort of the play. Go where they're not.
Smart.
Yeah.
Smart, very smart. Yeah.
In one of the interviews that you did, you mentioned that you didn't want to feel confined to just working for, say, Richemont Group, right? One brand. So
Yes.
you actually prefer working in this industry, which is the pre-owned watch market. But for you, you're saying that most of the new releases usually make it to this pre-owned like the secondary market within 6 months, right? But nowadays you see stuff come out just instantly. The moment it's released, it's already on the gray market. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between pre-owned and gray market. Gray market is like the watches. I don't know if you guys have Costco where you are, but it's
Yeah.
like a wholesale store. And you'll go in and you'll see, oh my God, they've got Rolex, they've got Omega, there's a Patek Philippe in here. Where'd this come from? That is sort of like a dealer giving to another dealer a watch that has never been owned by an end user. So that's gray market. That's a new watch being given by or sold by the original authorized dealer to some third party that then sells it again. Whereas with pre-owned, these are used watches. We are getting the watches from buyers. So if something does hit the pre-owned market like 3 days after it comes out, like a new Omega or Breitling or something, or even a Tudor, it means that someone bought that watch as a customer of an authorized dealer and then sold it to us. And that happens a lot with hot watches. A person will get a heads up from their dealer and they'll buy the watch. If they're on a wait list or they get the first right of refusal, they'll buy the watch. And then a lot of times they'll sell the watch to either Watchbox or one of our competitors. And so it's a watch that's a few days old, but it's genuinely pre-owned because we're not getting it from the original dealer. We're getting it from the guy who bought it from the dealer.
Do you think this is a good thing for, in general, for the market from the consumer's point of view? Because at least you have a chance to get the watch, even if it means paying a premium. Or do you think that this should be like so-called cleaned up?
No, I think it's fine. I think the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, needs to figure out how much scarcity it wants there to be in the market. And that's going to be really the only decision that affects supply and thus, as a result, the price. We offer instant gratification with these watches that are fairly recent but used. So yeah, the price is going to be higher, but you get the watch immediately. For some people, waiting 2 years for a Rolex is just not, it's not an option. They don't have that kind of patience. They don't have that kind of attention span. And I would say more often than not, you don't see this kind of inflation in price because the number of brands and the number of models that truly are trading far above retail is pretty low in relation to the number of watches that are out there. I've never seen a new Louis Ulysse Chopard hit the market used at 40 or 50% above retail. And those are great watches. If you want to buy a Chopard Alpine Eagle and, you can convince yourself that you don't have to have a Royal Oak or a Nautilus, you can get into that watch for under $13,000 new immediately or buy it used for even less. So, I do think it's a little bit unfortunate that maybe some watches like the 5711 are quite as expensive as they are today. But if you were in the market for a $33,000 watch and it's now a $90,000 watch, those are very much first world problems.
Yeah. Agree.
Yeah, I've got a further on question from that. So the secondary market, has morphed into this place where, before it was where you could pick up almost like a secondary car thing. You get as soon as it's driven off the forecourt, you're picking up watches were pretty much new or just been a few years old at 40%, 30% of the retail price. Now, as we've mentioned, there are watches, increasingly more watches than there were before, that are trading above retail and quite significantly so. I think in the last month, the prices have gone a bit crazy. Where do you see the market evolving? Like, how do you see that whole secondary market changing in, let's say, next 5 years?
I think there's going to be a little bit of deflation from the recent peaks we've seen. Stuff like the 5711, the Rolex Cermet, the Daytona. I think it's also fair to throw in certain Royal Oak models, the FP Journe Chronomètre Bleu. I think these things will always trade over their retail price, but I do think we'll see a backing off from the recent peaks. So if you ask me what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks, probably nothing, status quo. If you ask me what's going to happen by the end of this year, I think you'll see a little bit of a deflation of the market, and that should continue into the next year beyond in 2022. I also think realistically, there's still so many watches you can get at or below retail used, like any Omega, for example, short of like the Silver Snoopy 3. But if you just want a moon watch, or you want a dark side of the moon or a gray side of the moon, or you want the new Constellation, or you want a Globemaster, or you want to buy a Ploprof, you're still looking at that colossal depreciation on a great brand and mainstream models from that brand. Same is true of Breitling. The same is true of any Vacheron that's not an Overseas, of any Longa that's not an Odysseus, of most Grand Seiko models. So if you look around, you see there's a lot of opportunity to get watches that still are depreciated from their original sale price. We talked about Grubel 4C before the show. Great watches, absolutely fantastic. But right now, the market that is creating markups on watches is not interested in high complications, which is why a lot of grand complication Pateks sell for less than their retail price. The same is true of Grubel. The same is true of de Bethune right now. The same is also true of companies like Fernand Berthoud, which are incredibly high end. Depreciation is a real thing there. Most of the watches that have been bid up to ridiculous prices are watches that originally started at relatively reasonable prices, whether it's something like a sub $10,000 Oyster Perpetual 41 or a $33,000 Nautilus. These are nowhere near the upper echelons of pricing in the market. And maybe it's because they started so mainstream that they drew so much attention and ultimately doubled, tripled, quadrupled in value.
So those prices you said you think that they'd depreciate maybe towards the end of the year. Why do you think that they went so high, and what's going to cause them to come back down?
Bored rich people, to be perfectly honest, people stuck in their house with all the money in the world during the pandemic. It creates two things. One, people they entertain themselves by shopping and buying. And shopping for a watch is the most fun thing in the world. It's more than half the fun. So now they have all the time in the world to shop. They've got the money because for the most part, wealthy people were able to work from home and maintain their income streams. And then the larger number of opportunities to buy online, not new, but pre-owned. Online is the realm of pre-owned, really. And if you think about that, primary sales are not going to drive markups, but the pre-owned market, where you're not held to a recommended retail price, that allows prices to float upward as demand increases. And then finally, the more people spend online at home, the more time they spend online at home, the more social media they consume. And social media is addicted to a very small number of watches from maybe 6 brands.
That is really true. Yeah. Speaking about the pre-owned market, right? I read somewhere that, I think it's great advice. You said buy the seller. That was a quote that you said. So if you're looking to buy a watch, buy the seller, meaning you fully have to understand the seller, trust the seller before you purchase a piece, right? So when you say that, what are some of the questions to ask, and what are some of the red flags to look out for?
Well, I think the first question you ask is, do you have any testimonials that are real people with names and phone numbers and email addresses that I can reach out to? Because real customers are always the best vetting system. And in general, it would be great if these people are actually 100% independent of the seller. If you call a guy in California and you call a guy in Minnesota and you call a guy in Hong Kong and you call a guy in Zurich, and they have nothing in common except the fact that they all bought watches from this person or this vendor, and they all have similar reports that are positive. That's a real powerful tool for the buyer. So look for real references, testimonials with phone numbers, emails, and of course, like authentic direct contact, not anonymous names, not blurbs posted on the person's website with an internet handle like hot watches 4616166132. Just not that. The other thing is, you want to ask, how long have you been doing this? And the longer the person's been working in the watch industry, the better equipped the person is to judge anything from counterfeits to condition. If I've worked in this business I had a guy who declared himself a vintage Rolex expert 2 years ago. And then, the person was getting very belligerent about questions being asked of him. And it was just strange, because I would think that expertise takes more than 2 years to build. And I really do think that even if you are acting in good faith as a pre-owned vendor, if you haven't seen enough watches to understand the difference between good condition and bad condition, you probably haven't seen enough, for example, vintage Tudor Submariners to be able to judge an assembly of parts from an original watch. So experience counts, first for the sake of knowing your stuff and representing the watches correctly from experience. But also because the more skin you have in the game, the more of a reputation you have to to lose. And when a person has been a vintage watch dealer or a pre-owned watch dealer for 2 decades, that person is never going to cheat you or con you or play for every last cent, because lying or cheating or unfair dealing is going to come back and damage his future commercial prospects or her future commercial prospects. So the person who's been in the game long term has a reputation to lose and every incentive to represent himself or herself with ethics and integrity. I would also say that buying the seller is a matter of buying the seller's commitment to after sales service. So for example, if I buy a watch from you, can I return it? No questions asked if I don't like the way it fits. A lot of sellers will say, no, you bought the watch. If there's not a warranty issue or an authenticity issue, you're stuck with it. I believe that you should be able to return anything you buy on the internet if it doesn't fit, because how else would you know ultimately whether it fits you? So look for that kind of after sales support, the right of return, no questions asked. I would also ask, how long a warranty does this person give? Is it sold as is? Is it 90 days? Is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? This is a big deal. Watchbox, for example, gives 2 years and a 7-day right of return. So that's something I would look for. I would also ask, if I have a mechanical problem with the watch, are you going to try to service it at, quote, your guy in South Florida? Because your guy might be a tree shade mechanic with no certifications and no parts account. If I buy a Jaeger LeCoultre Duomet from you, I want to know that thing's going back to Jaeger LeCoultre, because there's no guy in South Florida who's qualified to open that up and work on it, much less make parts. So yeah, buy the seller on all those fronts.
All right.
Yeah, I got a continuation question from that because, there's lots of ways to buy watches online. Watchbox is one way, Watchfinder is another, StockX is another, right? So what about platforms like StockX? How do you see those kind of platforms developing where they take that authenticity? And when you say buy the seller, who is the seller there? Is it StockX or is it the person you don't know, right?
Yeah, you really don't know. The most difficult thing in the world is to buy a complicated product with very little information. And I feel like in the world of luxury, you need to be able to do a couple things. First, you need to be able to connect with the seller. You need to be able to ask questions. And then you need some sort of background assurance. So, on eBay, which is a platform where you may never be in contact with the seller directly, you can nevertheless still bid on an expensive watch with a huge range of buyer protections. Like, as a vendor, if you have a choice to sell a watch on eBay or sell it directly from your website, it's much more convenient as the seller to have an equal relationship rights-wise with the buyer. Whereas on eBay, the buyer rules. And that's something eBay has done over the years to build confidence in, the purchase of luxuries and cars, of watches on its platform. With StockX, you don't really have that range of protections. So I think the more mature non-vendor platforms like Chrono24 and eBay make it very clear how you're going to pay and how you're going to seek redress if you have a problem. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that, because StockX is it's opaque and it's a bit of a wild west. So the best you're going to do is maybe contact StockX representatives, and what are they going to tell you about a watch?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just had a follow-on question as well from that, which is Richemont bought Watchfinder, right? And obviously Richemont, they own a lot of brands. How are they going to use Watchfinder? Because they don't have Rolex on their books. They don't have all the RMs, APs, or Patek's, right? So how do you see Richemont utilizing that
for trades?
Platform?
Let's be totally honest. Richemont has a much higher margin of profit in a new watch. Like if you think about it, pre-owned, maybe a pre-owned vendor is going to pay like 40 to 45% of the retail price for watch, and then sell it at maybe 65 to 75%, sometimes less. So you can already see there that the profit margin is going to be thin compared to an OEM, which can make a watch and spends maybe 15% of the retail price making the watch. So if they discount 15%, you're still looking at a colossal 70-point margin. You're looking at basically the best way to make money fast with the watch is controlling the means of production. So why would they trade those huge margins? Like a lot of pre-owned vendors, they operate between about 15 and 30% profit margins, whereas the OEMs are going to be making 50 plus, even if they discount. So Richemont's not looking to sell pre-owned watches. It makes no sense if you control Jaeger LeCoultre, Alango and Zona, Baume and Mercier, which is huge in the East, not so much in the West, but it is big globally. They control Vacheron. They have a stake in Rubel Forsey. They control Panerai and IWC. All of these big maisons making watches that cost well into 5 or 6 figures, they want to sell those watches new. But unlike Watchbox, which is perfectly happy to buy a Patek Philippe or buy a Girard Perregaux or an Omega and then sell it used, Richemont can't sell Omegas out of the case in an IWC dealer. So what Watchfinder does is gives them the opportunity to take a trade like you would on a car. And, a Mercedes dealer is able to take in your Toyota or take in your Cadillac and sell you a Mercedes. They're not going to sell that car, that Cadillac, out of the Mercedes showroom. They're probably going to sell it on a used lot or send it to auction. So what Richemont is doing basically with Watchfinder, I thought it would be bigger ultimately than it turned out to be. But they're interested in selling new watches, and taking trades becomes possible when you have an aftermarket vendor that can price these things, buy them, and then sell them on a platform that's not a Richemont brand. So they get the ability to take trades on brands they don't sell.
Right. Final question before we hit the quick fire.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the US market, but in Asia, a lot of the collectors now associate Watchbox with FP Journe. So if you want to look for a piece, probably go to Watchbox. Is there a reason that we can find so many pieces at Watchbox, or is there a reason you guys probably decided to focus on the brand more?
Yeah, I mean, we were ahead of that. I've never been in love with the brand the way some collectors are. I respect it. I'm not head over heels. But I can tell you that in particular, Danny Goffberg, who was one of the co-founders of our company, was significantly ahead of the market in identifying Journe as the next big thing. Not so much on the new watch side. He was interested in watches that really no one wanted until very recently. Complications, moon phase watches, the Octolune, the Octa Divine, Octa UTC, like not the Chronomètre Bleu, which was already a thing and building momentum 3-4 years ago. And then the sports watches, which again, until really the last 24 months, people wanted dress watches from FP Journe. And I think the thought was, with the perspective he had on the brand and what they'd done through their first 30 years, well, not as Journe, not as Montre Journe, but since the first pocket watch in 1983, I think he saw an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of something that was going to be a real big deal 3 or 4 years down the line. And so a lot of those watches were purchased with a view to waiting for the market to develop. So I will say this, he was way ahead on that. Social media largely created the tinder for the escalation of interest in Journe. I don't necessarily think we created 100% of that organically. I think a lot of that was just people showing their watches and bragging about their watches on Facebook, on Pinterest, on Twitter, on especially Instagram, the number one driver of this sort of thing. So yeah, we've always liked Journe, and we used to like to boast that FP Journe started, selling pre-owned watches. And, if you wanted to find the best selection of pre-owned watches, you wouldn't go to Montre Journe, you would go to Watchbox. But I'll say this, we also love a lot of brands that, weren't really on anyone's radar for a long time. I love de Bethune. I love Moser. We're beginning to see Moser take off a little bit. De Bethune, I think, is still probably a year or two away. But we always like to try to figure out what the next big thing is going to be, because ultimately, even if you can buy Rolex steel watches all day long and Patek steel watches all day long, you're going to have to pay a lot of money for those. And the margins are going to be thin, even if the prices you sell them for are very high. So you want to get ahead of the game. And I would say more than anything on the sports watch side of the Journe movement, Danny was really very forward looking, because no one wanted titanium and aluminum Journe watches 3 years ago.
Yeah. That is right. All right. Any more questions, guys, before we move to quick fire?
Yeah, I do have one follow-up question from a few questions ago that I thought was very interesting what you mentioned, Tim. how, you saw an opportunity in the video section and this was years ago, right? But now you see more and more watch dealers, not amateur, but young watch dealers, or guys just started with a couple of $100,000 or partnering up with a couple of other guys, really coming on to this YouTube scene. We see a lot of YouTube channels filming their everyday life about inventory sales or going to watch buyer shows. And personally, this is my own opinion. I think we're gonna see a lot more of that. It's just because more people are interested in watches now, like that, plain and simple. How do you think going forward, where I mean, obviously Watchbox has a huge stake in the pre-owned secondary market already, but how do you think going forward, where there are a lot more going to be more competitors coming on board, what will Watchbox do to differentiate itself even more, or do you think it even has the need to do that since it already has such a big stake?
Yeah, I think it's always good to see other people in the space because it means the space is growing. There are some industries that have pretty much just petered out, and the less interest you see, the worse it gets. So I don't want to say a rising tide lifts all boats because competition and market share, those are facts of life, and there's only so much to go around. But we have two different channels for our videos. We have Watchbox Studios, which gives you those everyday perspectives and individual perspectives of traders and customers. And I do my Monday show, which is, a highly structured evening show like format. We have the trading desk on occasion. We have after hours, which is where traders talk about the business of the week. And then, of course, we have Mike Manjos talking about money and prices. So we've got that on one channel. And we always have the potential to add more things like on-site events at Dubai Watch Week or in Geneva if they ever come back with SIHH style events that you can actually go to. And of course, we have specials where we sit down with collectors or important industry figures like Mark Cho of the Armory, which I did last year, and people like Richard Peven, who's a major collector. And we're always going to make sure that there's a human face to what we do, that you can see the business side of things as the markets develop, but also the collector side of things. And that's what Watchbox Studios is. Then there's Watchbox Reviews, which I wanted to keep very consumer focused and a pure shopping experience or a research tool. So that's where you see my reviews and my inventory shows. And so they serve two very different purposes. There's a lot of room for growth on Watchbox Studios where you can do themed watch TV type things, but also reality type TV where you just go with, I don't know, a phone camera to a watch show and you walk around. So that's something we've already got with the opportunity to do more. But Watchbox Reviews, I got to be honest, I've been making these videos for 7 years and there's no secret about what I do. You pick up the watch, you talk about it, and you do it without making a mistake or stumbling, and you do it for 6 minutes. So I look at other channels that are doing watch reviews, and some of them are highly curated. There will be 50 to 80 different cuts of the image in a Watchfinder video, for example, which is why Watchfinder is going to put out, maybe a video a week. And then, Ariel Adams, who's a good friend, is doing watch reviews on his Blog to Watch channel, but they have to slice and dice and take a bunch of different takes and make one composite video. So until someone can do what I do, which is basically just shoot 8 of them in a row without taking a breath for air, there's not going to be anyone who intrudes on the volume of these things we're creating. So they're not going to create the same footprint on a search engine or the searchable database. And I'll also say this. I hold the all-time record for those things. I once shot 32 6-minute videos in a row, all one take. So,
Can I ask, do you read it or is it just coming off your head? Because I've always wondered when I'm listening to it, I'm thinking, is he reading this or is he actually?
I don't think he is.
But after meeting you, I'm thinking, I'm not so sure he's reading it.
Oh, no.
Like listening to you speak now, I'm like, he hasn't started or he hasn't even really needed to pause to think, and like it's amazing.
Yeah. It's actually a bit intense interviewing you, to be honest.
And also, I mean, Tim has just held these watches so many times. If you watch his videos with the same reference number, like, it's going to be different because it's unscripted and we're not robots. But you, in your review, like with the same watches, it's literally like, I sort of got, I know you're not reading, but you're just so good at it. You're just basically memorizing it off the top of your head. And it's very obvious that you can do that because you've seen and held so many of these watches. I mean, I've been watching you since you had the watch you want thing. I remember you had like a little I know, like a laminated poster that you put on the desk that shows the watch you want ink, and then you would review it. And that was like, I was in high school when I was watching that, and like way before any of this was happening. So it's just amazing how you started that early and you're still doing the same thing, because obviously that's what it works, and you're so good at it. And yeah, that's
I've refined. I have refined it. You know, in the early days, I didn't do wrist shots because I figured, well, my wrist doesn't look like your wrist, so why would you want to see it? But people asked for wrist shots, so I added that. Then people wanted to see the case backs of watches with solid case backs. So I started making sure, even if it's a Rolex and there's nothing there, I flip it to show the case back. And then I realized, you know, people were asking me questions like, well, okay, I could theoretically wear a 43.5 millimeter Planet Ocean, but how thick is it? I'm like, well, that's a good point. I should put thickness in there. And then people would say, you know, my wrist is round and narrow, so how broad is it across the wrist? And I thought, I'm just going to measure every dimension, put that in there, and give them a wrist shot. And then loom. Loom was the last thing I added, because if the watch is loomed, you should get a loom shot. So I have added as people have asked, and I have gotten better at the presentation. I think in the early days, it was a little bit stressful to realize, oh, geez, I've only got so much time before I've got to get something else done. So if I make a mistake, I'm sunk. Whereas these days, I mean, I didn't make mistakes then, but I worried about it. These days, I don't even worry about it. So it's become sort of like muscle memory.
for sure.
Well,
But,
I think people
go
listening,
ahead.
are gonna like probably screaming down the microphone saying you need to ask this question, which is, when did you realize this is what you wanted to do? That's number one. And two, when you do so many 32 videos of watches, are you not numb to watches anymore? What actually makes you tick on the watches side?
Well, the 32 videos, I'll just say that was before the COVID shutdown, and we closed our office for about 2 weeks, early last year. And I didn't want the channel to go dark. So I thought, okay, I'm going to sit down with as many of these watches as I can safely carry away in my cart. And I'm going to shoot until I'm done. And I've got enough material to last through 2 weeks. So that's where that came from. Why do I do it? Well, I was always a fan of watches in sort of a distant, admiring kind of way. While I was in the Navy, while I was in my first job out of college, while I was in college, I'd say I probably realized mechanical watches were something I really enjoyed late in my high school career. But at the time, you're talking about 2000, 2001, there was almost no presence online for watch collectors. Very little. Chronocentric Time Zone, an early version of Purists Pro. And so I didn't even realize that this was a hobby. I thought it was just a weird, narrow fixation, not that there was a community built around it and whole magazines devoted to it. So there was an early interest in watches. And as I got older, the more I realized there was, in fact, a community. And this is a hobby. This isn't just like my own weird fixation. There are other people who feel the same way. It's a common weird fixation. So that sort of helped me develop a better sense that there were people like me to whom I could speak about these things. And then in the Navy, I bought my first real high-end luxury watch. It was a Jaeger LeCoultre. And then I realized when I was getting out of the Navy in 2013, okay, the safe play is just to do something similar to what I did and be a press officer or public relations for someone in the private sector. But since I'm not really bound to anyone's requirements or mission anymore, let me first see if I can make a hobby into a job. So, that term, turn your profession and your passion into one, or turn your passion into a profession. Yeah, I was kind of looking for that. And pretty soon I found people who were selling used watches in Midtown New York. And most of what they did was farmed out to either Eastern Europe or India from like a tech support standpoint, but they couldn't find people who were idiomatic English speakers and writers to fill out their websites and write their ad copy. So I found an early toehold in the watch industry there. And then I saw an ad on the Watch You Want blog. So, I said, no one reads those vendor blogs. I did. And they had an ad for someone. I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll get a freelance fee. I'll give them some blogs. And they liked me enough that they flew me down to Florida and they interviewed me. And that was in June of 2014. And by the end of July, I was down there working with them full time. And I still do enjoy watches. I think a lot of people think since I sold my collection, most of my collection anyway, I still have a few, that I'm not interested in watches. And I would say, well, to that, Johnny Lieberman of Motor Trend doesn't own 26 Ferraris and 14 Lamborghinis and 6 McLarens and 10 classic cars. Sometimes when you're really close to the industry, the experience is enough. And for me, knowledge is ultimately what I own. Everything I learn about those watches, I retain forever. And so a part of them becomes a part of me forever. If I didn't have so much firsthand access to watches, I would probably be much more committed as a cash and check collector who's writing the check to be able to own and experience the watch I wouldn't otherwise have. So being close to watches makes it easy for me to feel satisfied and still stay enthused without spending a lot of money. But I still love watches and I still love talking about watches. I never burned out.
That's really well said. I know you have an affinity to JLC, right? But I was also wondering, because you have to remain neutral when you make the videos, how do you make sure you don't get poisoned by social media and stuff? Because you check your Instagram, you check Facebook and everything. How do you stay completely neutral?
Yeah, well, for the most part, I don't participate in any social media. I've got YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and I tend them as personal, marketing platforms and community nexus, but I don't actually go on anyone else's Instagram and look at what people are posting. When people tag me, for the most part, I don't pay attention. When other Facebook groups are referenced on my Facebook group, I don't even bother to look. And I had a Facebook account back in 2004 when I was in college, when you needed a college email account to join. And I basically just forgot about it to the point where when I was creating the Facebook group at the suggestion of a coworker, I had to create a new account because I wasn't even active on Facebook, for over a decade. So I had to create a Facebook account just to have my own Facebook group. And then on YouTube, I'm always on YouTube. I'm a very online YouTuber, but the stuff that interests me is rarely the watch space. Every once in a while, I'll look around to see how many subscribers or how many views or, what's the focus of other channels. But it's not like I'm streaming hours and hours of Facebook, YouTube, and or I should say Facebook or YouTube. There's video on both now. But I watch a ton of car videos on YouTube. I watch a ton of pro gaming on YouTube. I watch a ton of videos about bikes and the bike industry because that's one of my hobbies and my passions. And, almost none of my YouTubing outside of work involves watches.
Have you ever thought about doing your own YouTube channel? I know that you technically have to, but seriously, your own, or is that something against company policy, or is that something you're not allowed to do?
No, they were okay with timmosso.com, which is my articles and my podcasts. So they were happy enough with me building out my own presence as a personality because people associate me with the brand. There's never going to be a confusion there. With YouTube, part of it's time. I don't have a whole lot of spare time. And I would say between illustration and guitar, I don't have a whole lot of after hours time left to build out another Tim Mosso property. I don't want to have a lot of undernourished and emaciated social media platforms because there's some people who start a Facebook group and they never show their face again. They just want to be able to say they have 200, 300 people in the Johnny Y or Johnny Z Facebook group. And a lot of folks don't respond on their YouTube videos. Whereas if you go under my Monday show, there will be 100 responses and 50 of them will be me. So I like to really engage with the social media I do have, which doesn't leave me with a whole lot of spare time to conceive of and develop, for example, a Tim Mosso YouTube channel. Also, because we do have two channels, and I don't love the fact that there are two separate channels. It was necessary because one is themed content and one is just watch videos. But I really want to avoid having a third YouTube channel. And so if I were to create another YouTube channel, it would probably be something like a car discussion forum where I would get together with friends and fans who love cars. And we do what we're doing right here. We do a Zoom call and we just talk trends in the auto industry and collecting what we're shopping right now, what we've driven, motorsports, technology, that sort of thing. It would be along those lines. It would be one of my other interests.
Yeah.
And it's something I develop. You can see I do illustration. Here's a
I had
Rolex.
Oh my
no idea when
God.
you said that. I was
Wow.
gonna ask. Wow.
That
So Tim's
literally
just
looks like
shown,
a photo.
is that pencil? Is that pencil drawing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is. It's not done
Okay.
yet. It's not
Okay.
finished yet. So
So
I'm
Tim
still
has
working.
just, for people listening, has just shown his, I guess, his drawing pad, and there is a black and white
Ceramic,
graphite
Yeah.
drawing of
Wow.
Daytona. Looks like the panda dial.
Wait,
That's it.
Oh my
Halen when
God.
he was young.
is this
Oh
public
my
info?
God.
Because I had no idea that you were into illustration or guitars.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
it's not something I talk about too often. It's definitely not something I advertise in my public persona as a spokesman for Watchbox, but I am working on a comic book. And so when I have more news about that, I'll definitely share.
That's
Okay.
so cool.
I have
So cool.
a final question before we
Sure.
hit the quick fire, which is, what's the next thing for Tim Mosso?
The next thing is to travel more. I mean, I got to admit, I hate flying, but a lot of the collectors who have made my career possible are located overseas or on the West Coast of the US or down in Miami or in the Southwest. And in order to kind of give back and acknowledge the community that's built up around my social media, I really do need to go out and meet those people face to face. So right now I'm expanding my interactions with watch clubs and collectors via private Zoom meetings that we're scheduling out at work. And we're bringing in people from Silicon Valley and finance, car fans, that sort of thing. And we're bringing them in smaller groups and they're doing sessions with me. But ultimately, it's going to be Hong Kong. It's going to be Singapore. We have offices in both. It's going to be Thailand, where we see a fertile ground for the growth of luxury watches. It's going to be the Middle East, where we've got an office, and continental Europe, where we're local in Neuchâtel, but also the UK, a place we really haven't probed too much. So I will be traveling more and meeting more people in person to try to take the online guy offline and make face a little more familiar.
Okay, so more holistic.
Yeah. Plus, I would like to get a law degree. I'll be honest. That is something that does motivate me immensely. I have an interest in public interest, in advocacy, environmental, and these are all things that are very interesting to me and challenging in a way that the watch industry no longer is. So I want to make sure I've got another horizon. Because if you're the dog who catches the car, you got to ask what next. And I caught the car.
I'm really blown away by how he's anyways, Dan, you must know what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
Like,
I
whoa,
know.
yeah.
Efficiency is off the charts.
That's like
and then
my
all kind
goal.
of strategic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, let's do the quick fire.
Okay.
I have 7 questions. Whoever wants to come in after me, go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so following what you just said, first place you want to visit after COVID, first place you want to fly to?
Hong Kong. I haven't been there. I've been to the Singapore office. I haven't been to Hong Kong.
You haven't been to Hong Kong ever?
Nope, haven't, not yet.
Oh, we need to hit. We need to. I mean, sometimes I'm down there, and Long sometimes down there. So maybe we can bump into you.
Yeah. Watch you wear the most?
My Zen Easy M11. It's the only watch I've worn daily since 2018, and oddly, the watch that's gotten the second most time in those last 3+ years was a Devon Tread that was sent to me by the factory for a trial. That was the second
Devon
most.
Tread. Wow. Okay, that's a rare. I've never seen one.
Sorry, Urwerk, Debethune, or MBNF, if you had to choose one.
Debethune, no question. It would be the DB27 Polo. They prototyped it. They never made the 10 pieces of the limited edition. But if they ever wanted to do me a real solid, they would make one example of that watch so I could own it. 5,000 Vickers hardness, scratch proof, dent proof, indestructible, jump hour, 5-day automatic movement, and remarkably stark with black case and floating lubs. So it would be Debethune, that model specifically.
Nice. Favorite watch release from this year?
Sartori Ballard SB05.
Okay, interesting.
Why?
Why? Because
Beauty.
Well, it's
why no, Jacqueline's asking why pick that watch. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say for a couple of reasons. Beauty, sizing. It's truly one of the most bewitching combinations of proportion and dial detail you're going to find. In particular, the blued titanium sheen of the titanium dials, the fact that it does have an interesting movement. It's a smaller brand watch, but the caliber that's in there is beautifully laid out in terms of architecture, nicely finished. It gives you the beauty of a manual movement, but with a 90-hour power reserve, and the opportunity to know on a first name basis the people who make and deliver your watch. For me, hugely appealing. Other than that, I would say maybe the Breitling Premier Heritage Pistachio dial, which is very cool and properly sized at 40 millimeters. Also a manual watch in a different kind of green than we're seeing everywhere else this year. And finally, the Debatoon DB27 Titan Hawk, another big green machine. That one is, again, from a brand I love with the dial I would favor. So I like all of those.
All right. Least favorite watch released this year?
I would say my least favorite watch released this year is probably the new Breitling Chronomat that just came out in the last 24 hours. The Super Chronomat collection.
It's like 44 millimeter or something, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I even think it might be 45. And for me, this watch, it feels like something that would have come out in 2007, 2008. It's way too big. It is a 44 millimeter watch now that I think about it, but it's also a very thick watch. It's a very heavy watch. It feels like the successor to like the Super Avenger 2. And I just feel like right now, a watch that big, that loud, and I don't know, that overwrought just feels like a bad match for our times, and something that's at least 13, 12 years out of step with what the market wants. I think it's just kind of a tone deaf release. Even if I will say the quality of the watch is high, the size and proportions are wrong.
So you obviously talk a lot about the size and proportions and the fit. I think you're a strong advocate for smaller size watches, especially from the interviews I've listened to you do with collectors, especially. So what would you say is, like, in your opinion, the right size for this time period that we're in for collectors?
I'm going to give credit to Jaeger LeCoultre, 39 millimeters. That's the size of their masters and their ultra thins. And I also think that's the size of the Chronomet Bleu. It's a perfect size. It's, the right size between mid 20th century 33 to 35 millimeters and the excess of the 42 to 45 millimeter dress watch we saw back in the 2000s and early 2010s. So for me, 39 is just about perfect. And I think, plus or minus 1 millimeter, you've got a little bit of room to tailor, but right around 39 is going to be the sweet spot, and preferably 39 and fairly thin. I don't think a watch should be too thick where you start to lose some of the advantages of a smaller case.
All right. Favorite app on your phone?
That's a great question, because my phone is right here, and it's actually the phone that shot the first 800 Watch You On videos. And this phone is 8 years old. Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah. My God.
It is an iPhone. I'll take it out of its case. It's an iPhone 5 in museum condition from 8 years ago.
Oh my God.
It is actually. He's not bullshitting. It is.
Yeah, when he picked it up, I was like, nah, it can't be. Whoa.
I would have to
That's
look.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, because the iOS on this thing hasn't been supported in at least 3 years. So I don't have a whole lot of apps on here. I would say I probably like of the apps I've got, probably the Amtrak application. And this is I'll show it to you. This is an app you use to
World
schedule
Traveler.
Oh my gosh.
Social media is obnoxious. Uber is like the end of fair employment, but I've got the Amtrak app.
I'm sorry, but the amount of time that it took for the phone to load up
Yeah.
app is hilarious.
Yeah. I still don't think you can actually use the app yet. Like, it was on Amtrak for ages.
All the trains move slow.
That's hilarious.
In the United States, they do.
Final question.
Sure.
I had to ask this. Favorite car?
I would say my all-time favorite car. And this is the hardest question you've asked. Wow, all of a sudden you stalled me here. My all-time favorite car is probably either a 1969 tri-power Corvette Stingray.
Whoa.
with a 410 rear axle, and I love motorsports, probably a Pano's Esperante GTLM Coupe, because I think they made somewhere between 8 and 12. And I watched that car every one of the 24 hours as it crawled its way to the front and won the class back in 2006 at Le Mans. So I have positive associations with that old car. If I ever run into one of the roughly dozen built, I'm going to have to buy it.
Very cool. Great answer.
Okay, I
Wow.
don't think we're gonna top that. I had a few more questions, but I know that Tim, you're obviously like on a bit of a time crunch, so we'll just end this episode. I'll ask my questions offline, and hopefully we'll get you back on for a second episoder.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you on, Tim. I think it's great to because I'm so used to your videos, almost as you say, growing up with them, that I will say, for me, it's a good opportunity to actually see the person and hear more about the person, and to match up rather than just these person saying all these facts and stuff. And I will say, from a moderator, interviewer, host position, this was intense, man. Like,
wow,
the way you skittled through the questions, I was like, man, this guy is the equivalent of those vehicles that make roads flat because they're so, you know what I mean?
Steamroller.
Like, he literally, steamroller. He literally just steamrolled the questions, like, and it wasn't like you didn't answer the question either. It was so precise, so efficient. You are the person exactly on the YouTube, but then to hear the more human side about the illustration you do and the other interests you have, that was great to hear, and I'm sure the audience will appreciate that. So thank you very much for making time. I know you have a very busy schedule, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Well, guys, you have my gratitude and my thanks.
Okay,
thanks, Tim.
So see you guys on the next one. Thank you for tuning in, guys. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Waiting List podcast. Hit the subscribe button and the next episode will come straight to your phone as soon as it's ready. Whilst I'm here, please remember to leave a nice review and follow us on Instagram at the Waiting List podcast.